Apush review in 10 minutes.
The first English colony in the New World was Roanoke, established in 1587 by our main man, Sir Walter Raleigh. When our dog came back several years later, the colonists vanished and were never found. Roanoke became known as a lost colony.
Jamestown was the first successful English colony established by Captain John Smith and settlers in search for gold, but instead they earned money off planting tobacco known as brown gold.
The rest of the 13 colonies were established along the east coast, the very first being Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, and Pennsylvania, which was granted to William Penn as a way to pay off a history of debt owed to him.
Later, in 1730, there was a religious revival called the Great Awakening, which was a period of time where religion prospered and revivals led by evangelical Protestant ministers brought people back to church.
When Indians attacked Nathaniel Bacon and others, and Jamestown settlers refused to help, Nathaniel Bacon was like a what the heck? Y'all leave me out here like this? So he burned Jamestown with the help of an angry mob.
When the French and Indian War broke out in 1754, the colonists and Britain fought against New France and the Native Americans who allied with France. The Proclamation of 1763 was established by Britain directly after the war to minimize fighting against Native Americans and the colonists. It restricted the colonists from settling the past Appalachian Mountains.
Britain continued to restrict the colonists with the passing of the Sugar Act, the Quartering Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Act. These all consisted of taxes on glass, paint, oil, lead, paper, tea, and the requiring of colonists to shelter British soldiers. These angered colonists greatly.
In protest to the Townshend Act, many colonists dressed up as Indians and dumped tea into the Boston harbor in 1773. This was known as the Boston Tea Party. Another key event was the Boston Massacre, which started with some snowballs being thrown and ended with 5 civilians killed by British soldiers, including Crispus Attucks.
The Intolerable Acts was the American patriots' name for a series of laws passed by the British Parliament in 1774, after the Boston Tea Party. They were meant to punish the Massachusetts colonists for their defiance. In Great Britain, these laws were referred to as the Coercive Acts. The acts took away Massachusetts' self-government and historic rights. They were key developments in the outbreak of the American Revolution in 1775.
The First Continental Congress was a convention of delegates from 12 colonies that met on September 5, 1774, at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, early in the American Revolution. It was called in response to the passage of the Intolerable Acts by the British Parliament.
The battles of Lexington and Concord were the first military engagements in the American Revolutionary War. They were fought on April 19, 1775. 2 lanterns hanging from Boston's North Church informed the countryside that the British were going to attack by sea. Sure enough, when the advance guard of nearly 240 British soldiers arrived in Lexington, they found about 70 Minutemen formed on the Lexington Green waiting for them. And then the shot heard round the world was fired. The militia was outnumbered and fell back, but later, when more Minutemen arrived, they inflicted heavy damage on the British regulars as they marched back towards Boston.
The Declaration of Independence was drafted by Thomas Jefferson and was adopted in July 1776. It stated the reasons the British colonies of North America sought independence and announced that the 13 American colonies would no longer be a part of the British Empire, and they would now become the United States of America. The Revolutionary War lasted for 7 more years, and eventually on September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed and the colonies were officially granted freedom.
The first man to leave the United States as an independent country was George Washington, who was a head general during the Revolution, but when the first presidential election was held, he received a vote from every elector. Washington served 2 terms as president, setting the 2-term precedent, and later died on December 14, 1799.
The third President of the United States was Thomas Jefferson, whose presidency was famous for the Louisiana Purchase in 1803.
Jefferson then hired Lewis and Clark to explore the territory, educating the rest of the United States on the uncharted territory. Meanwhile, Marbury versus Madison was a landmark Supreme Court case during Jefferson's presidency, which resulted from a petition to the Supreme Court by William Marbury, who had been appointed Justice of the Peace in the District of Columbia by President John Adams, but whose commission was not subsequently delivered. Due to John Marshall, the Chief Justice, the case resulted in the basis for the exercise of judicial review.
In 1820, Henry Clay, the Great Compromiser, proposed the Missouri Compromise that, in an effort to preserve the balance of power in Congress between slave and free states, admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state. Furthermore, with the exception of Missouri, this law prohibited slavery in the Louisiana Territory north of the 3630 latitude line.
Another very significant president is Andrew Jackson, who was elected in 1829 and was most famous for the passage of the Indian Removal Act. The Indian Removal Act was a law passed by Congress on May 28, 1830, which authorized the president to negotiate with Indian tribes in the southern United States for their removal to the federal territory west of the Mississippi River in exchange for their homelands. This trip out west became known as the Trail of Tears because so many of the Native Americans died on the awful trip to the west.
In the 19th century, Manifest Destiny was widely held the belief of the United States and that American settlers were destined to expand throughout the continent. Americans began to believe that it was their God-given right to own all the land from ocean to ocean.
Eventually, the issue of slavery led to the American Civil War when the South seceded, calling themselves the Confederate States of America. The war lasted for 4 years, from 1861 to 1865, under the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. During the Civil War, the U.S. Congress passed a Subscription Act that produces the first wartime draft of the U.S. citizens in American history.
A very important court case that came about during Reconstruction was Plessy versus Ferguson, upholding the constitutionality of state laws requiring racial segregation in public facilities under the doctrine of separate but equal. Separate but equal remains standard doctrine in U.S. law until its repudiation in the 1954 Supreme Court decision Brown v. Board of Education.
The Spanish-American War was a conflict in 1898 between Spain and the United States, the result of the American intervention in the Cuban War of Independence. The ship USS Maine exploded and killed 266 sailors due to technical issues, but many thought the Spanish were responsible for it.
The Teller Amendment was an amendment of the Declaration of War on Spain that said the U.S. would not try to annex Cuba if it was to win the war, or throughout the fighting. The Platt Amendment was an amendment to the Cuban Constitution which allowed U.S. troops to intervene in Cuba.
The Triple Wall of Privilege was President Woodrow Wilson's plan for the mechanisms that, at the time, were protecting the very wealthy from having to contribute their share to the economy, and the three items in the wall were the tariff, banks, and trusts.
The main causes of World War I, which began in Central Europe in late July 1914, included many factors such as the conflict and hostility between the great European powers of the 4 decades leading up to the war. Militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism played major roles in the conflict as well. The immediate origins of the war, however, lay in the decisions taken by statesmen and generals during the July crisis of 1914 caused by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife.
The Scopes trial was a famous American legal case in 1925 in which a substitute high school teacher, John Scopes, was accused of violating Tennessee's Butler Act, which made it unlawful to teach human evolution in any state-funded school.
The New Deal was a set of federal programs launched by President Franklin D. Roosevelt after taking office in 1933, in response to the calamity of the Great Depression. It had 4 major goals and achievements: economic recovery, job creation, investment in public works, and civil uplift.
The Second World War began in September 1939 when Germany, under Chancellor Adolf Hitler, invaded Poland. Britain and France responded by declaring war on Germany, but took little action over the following month. The United States later joined the war after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. The war was the largest armed conflict in history, spanning the entire world and involving more countries than any other war.
Civil war between North. The war in Europe ended on May 7, 1945, when German representatives signed the surrender document in Reims, France. Germany was in ruins. When Hitler saw the end of the war coming, he hid himself in a bunker and committed suicide with his wife.
Although the war in Europe came to an end, war between the U.S. and Japan still raged on. Woodrow Wilson eventually made the decision to drop the atomic bomb for the first time in the city of Hiroshima. Japan refused to surrender, so Wilson was forced to drop another bomb in the city of Nagasaki. On August 15th, just days after the bombing, Japan announced its surrender to the Allies.
The Marshall Plan was the American initiative to aid Europe, in which the United States gave $13 billion in economic support to help rebuild European economies at the end of World War II in order to help prevent the spread of Soviet communism.
Civil war between North and South Korea. United States joined to support South Korea, and the PRC helped North Korea along with the United Nations. It ended on July 27, 1953, when negotiations concluded and fighting ended. During this period, General Douglas MacArthur was in command, and due to his radical request, Truman released him of his position.
Joseph McCarthy spent about 5 years to expose communists within the U.S. government. At the time, many Americans were afraid of such people looming in America, and he further spread this anti-communist movement.
Occurring in October 1962, it lasted 13 days over the installation of nuclear-armed Soviet missiles on Cuba. The U.S. avoided nuclear warfare when America agreed to the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev offer to remove the missiles if the U.S. promised to not invade Cuba. That was the Cuban Missile Crisis.
McCarthy spent about 5 years to...
JFK! JFK!
Occurring in no.
JFK was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. The 35th President, John F. Kennedy, was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald while riding in a convertible vehicle.
The Vietnam War was a war to end North Vietnam communist regime, South Vietnam being allied with the U.S. In total, 3 million people were killed.
On June 17, 1972, a seemingly random robbery at a Washington, D.C. building leads to Nixon's resignation, the first one in U.S. history. Nixon was found trying to cover up the burglary and prevent the FBI from investigating the Watergate scandal.
Being the 39th president, Carter dealt with a major energy crisis, high inflation, and unemployment. Also, he reopened relations with China in 1980, and he was defeated by Ronald Reagan due to his unpopularity.
The U.S. policy pertaining to homosexuals enrolling and participating in the military. The name was picked up when President Clinton signed the law that said, "Don't ask, don't tell, don't pursue, and don't harass."
Reagan, the 40th president, was also known as the Great Communicator. He was popular two-term president, and while in office, cut taxes, increased defense spending, and brought a quicker end to the Cold War.
George Bush served as the 41st president and promised to bring a kinder, gentler nation. He served as VP to Reagan, also serving in World War II. In office, he launched a successful military operation against Panama and Iraq. However, the country faced an economic recession. Bush lost the following election to Bill Clinton.
And that is
Apush
review
in 14 but 10 minutes. Okay,
thanks for watching. From yours truly. I messed that up.